Hello everyone and welcome to yet another video. After the disappointment that was the ASUS ROG Zephyrus G15, I needed to reunite with my favorite laptop ever, a pre-Retina MacBook Air. When I saw one available for $77 US, I knew that I couldn't pass on it. So here I am with a 2015 pre-Retina MacBook Air. But before we check it out, please consider subscribing so I can make more videos. Let's talk about the MacBook Air first. When it first came out in 2008, it was a big deal, and although Apple did take it to a completely new level with the release of the ARM chips, I never actually stopped loving my first MacBook Air, which was a mid-2013 model. So what do we have here, and what does $77 US get you in 2024? As you might have guessed from the video title, it's an early 2015 MacBook Air. I'll start by saying that I love the design of these MacBooks. Aside from the ridiculously thick screen bezels, I'm gonna go ahead and say that it doesn't look too old. Considering the original design is all the way from 2008, I call that a win. For comparison, this is what a Windows laptop from 2008 looks like. Let's have a look at the build quality and the cosmetic state of our laptop after 8 years of heavy use. In Apple fashion, this laptop is all metal and there's very little keyboard and screen flex. After 8 years of heavy use, there are a fair bit of dings, dents, and scratches on this MacBook, which is expected. And what else is common about these MacBooks is that the corners will get dented, and there's not much you can do to fix that. I can tell that no maintenance ever been done on this MacBook in the last 8 years, and I could tell so because the hinges were loose and I had to open up the laptop to fix it. And I did, but at what cost? I ended up breaking this plastic piece, that's the hinge cover. For what it's worth, it's a cheap fix, it's a cheap replacement, but I'm not sure if I'm gonna spend the extra $10 on it. The specs is where our poor MacBook Air shows its age. We have a dual-core, quad-thread Intel Core i5-5250U with a total cache of around 3 megabytes. This is coupled with 4 gigabytes of DDR3 RAM and 128 gigabytes of PCIe SSD storage. It also has a 54 watt-hour battery that could last up to 12 hours when it was new. This laptop didn't ship with a charger, so I had to get a MagSafe charger from Amazon for around 20 Canadian dollars. I've always loved MagSafe charging. I had my first MacBook Air when I was in high school, and it definitely saved my laptop from destruction a fair bit of times, so I'm grateful that it exists. We keep talking about how things are soldered on new MacBooks and Macs in general, and it all started with this MacBook Air. Fortunately, you can still replace the SSD and the battery, but the RAM is soldered on, and it being 4 gigabytes, I thought at first that it could really use an upgrade to 8 or possibly 16 gigabytes. Speaking of the battery, I mentioned that it could last up to 12 hours when it was new. Back in 2013, when I had my MacBook Air, I was constantly able to beat that estimate by a good hour to hour and a half under normal circumstances, which is 4 to 5 Safari tabs, a Word document, and possibly other apps in the background. However, in 2024, after 8 years of use and 1240 battery cycles, this laptop only retains 53% of its original battery capacity, and it lasts up to 3 to 3.5 hours. If you want to keep using a MacBook from this era, fortunately the battery is not glued on. It takes about 5 minutes to replace the battery, and replacement batteries cost anywhere between 30 to 50 Canadian dollars on Amazon. I mentioned earlier that the SSD is not soldered on, and it's technically replaceable, but Apple back in the day didn't want to go for the M.2 interface, so they went for their own implementation. You have two options if you do want to replace the SSD. You can either get one of the official SSDs that use this connector, or you can get a M.2 to Apple adapter that would allow you to put whatever SSD you want in your MacBook. However, I did say whatever SSD, but there is a list of SSDs that are confirmed to be working on this laptop. Don't just buy whatever SSD that you found online for cheap. There is a high chance that it might not work. Let's talk about the user experience. Firstly, you can open the lid with one hand, which used to be Apple exclusive back in 2015. When you open the lid, you get greeted by a non-retina 13-inch screen with a resolution of 1440 by 900. I got my first MacBook Air in 2013, and even then the screen was one of the biggest shortcomings of this laptop, and that's only amplified in 2024. Even when you're working on a Word document, you can easily count the number of pixels on the screen, and although that doesn't cause a problem if this is the only laptop that you're using, if you do switch back and forth between this laptop and a newer MacBook, you'll see the difference right away and it will bother you. It being a TN panel for whatever reason, the viewing angles are bad. This was Apple's way of cutting corners back in the day and keeping the MacBook Air as an entry-level device. But regardless, it wasn't a cheap laptop back in the day, and it was being sold alongside their Retina MacBooks, so I'm not sure why Apple never chose to upgrade the screen. Also, I can tell you with confidence that this isn't the most color-accurate laptop that I've ever used. It has arguably one of the best features on MacBooks: automatic screen brightness. The keyboard is backlit, and just like the screen, it's automatic. It's really weird that most Windows laptops still don't have these features. You might remember the whole backlash against butterfly keyboards that Apple tried to introduce back in 2015, 2016, and ultimately they had to take a step back and bring back this kind of keyboard. So, in theory, typing on this keyboard is great. The keys feel perfectly fine, they're great. However, it being a laptop from 2015 and it being an entry-level MacBook from 2015, it's slow, and especially when autocorrect hits for whatever reason, you'll get these micro stutters that do hinder the experience. The trackpad shows its age mostly because it's not as big as modern-day trackpads, but aside from that, even when you're switching back and forth between this MacBook Air and like a modern MacBook, you don't feel any difference. It's pretty much seamless. The only difference between this and a modern day trackpad, aside from the size, is Force Touch, which is not necessarily something that I keep looking for when I'm using this MacBook. We also have a dual speaker setup. Back in 2013 and even in 2015, this used to be great. I used to love the speaker array on my MacBook Air, and there wasn't that big of a difference between a MacBook Air and a MacBook Pro in terms of the sound quality, and MacBook Pros used to be the benchmark. They still are, but now if you compare this with a modern day MacBook Pro, well, they don't even compare. We have a 720p camera and a dual microphone array. The webcam does okay in well-lit scenarios and is quite bad at night. Microphone array is pretty good, although it doesn't compare to a newer MacBook. I've joined Zoom and Google Chat meetings on this laptop, and people were able to see and hear me well. Now, let's talk about how usable this poor MacBook Air is in 2024. Officially, the latest macOS version that this laptop supports is Monterrey, but with the use of a third-party app called the Open Core Patcher, you can install Sonoma or whatever comes after that. We'll start with Monterrey and we'll make our way to the latest version to see if there are any differences in performance, usability, in quality of life features, etc. Firstly, although obviously not as good as modern laptops, the boot time isn't that bad. Daily tasks like editing a Word document or web browsing are completely fine as long as you're okay with waiting a couple seconds for this poor laptop to catch its breath. And if you want to give multitasking a shot, you must be okay with waiting more than a couple seconds. When I'm using a macOS device, I try to use Safari as much as possible as it's more resource efficient, and overall I think it works a little bit better, especially on old MacBooks, and that's what I did. So having a couple Safari tabs open is completely fine, up to 4 or 5 even, that's fine. However, if you have 1080p YouTube playing in the background, you will have stutters and quick freezes, especially if you're switching between tabs or if you have something else open in the background. But aside from that, opening first-party apps like Settings, Messages, FaceTime, Notes is completely fine, again, as long as you're okay with waiting a second here and there for this MacBook to catch its breath. But how about Sonoma, the latest macOS version? I mentioned earlier that Apple doesn't officially support Sonoma on this laptop, but through the use of Open Core Legacy Patcher, you should be able to download and install whatever macOS version that you want on this MacBook. And it's supposed to be a simple and straightforward process in theory. However, in practice, although the installation process itself is simple and straightforward, It took me about 2 to 2.5 hours to download the OS version directly from Apple. There I see two options, two reasons. Either Apple servers were down for maintenance, or Apple is actively trying to prevent users from downloading their OS for this purpose. Either way, I managed to download it, I installed it, and here it is. Firstly, you can tell that Sonoma is really optimized for faster SSDs just from the way Spotlight and settings work. Spotlight is significantly slower on Sonoma than it was on Monterey, and obviously it's much slower on this MacBook than it is on any other modern MacBook. Settings, similarly, it takes its time to open up, and the icons themselves even take long to load up. Genuinely, I thought that RAM would be a bottleneck in daily use, but no, it was the processor. So 4GB of RAM on this MacBook is still completely fine, and for what it's worth, I haven't seen it gone up beyond 3GB, which is okay, I think. So this definitely gives some credibility to Apple saying that 8GB of RAM on their MacBooks is pretty much equivalent to 16GB of RAM for Windows laptops. Don't get me wrong, I would still appreciate more RAM and I would definitely like to be able to upgrade it, but I'm just saying that it's not as big of a deal as we all initially thought. Aside from that, no matter what OS you're using, all the quality of life features that macOS brings and the Apple environment brings in general are available on this MacBook. Okay, I need to add a quick note here. Although this laptop definitely got slower over time because of its low-end specs and the fact that apps got more resource intensive, it wasn't until the ARM MacBooks that we were able to see this difference. So if you go out of your way today and grab a 2017 MacBook Pro, a base model with a dual-core processor and 8GB of RAM, you'll see that the experience that you'll have on that laptop is not going to be that much different compared to this. It's only the ARM MacBooks that truly unlocked the potential of macOS and made it much more of an optimized operating system. I used several MacBooks since the day I got my MacBook Air. I had a 2015 MacBook Pro that worked just fine, that also had a dual-core processor and 8GB of RAM. I had a 2018 MacBook Pro 15-inch and a 2019 MacBook Pro 16 inches before I made the switch to ARM. And I made videos about those, and they were also slow. They were slow for different reasons, namely thermals, and also the fact that, macOS was not super optimized for Intel processors. They left some work to be done, I'm assuming, because they wanted to switch to ARM, and they wanted to make the performance leap bigger than it could be had macOS been fully optimized for Intel processors. But that's just a note, so if your comparison scope is only between Intel MacBooks, this MacBook is not that far behind. It's only the ARM MacBooks that are significantly better in daily tasks, like opening up Safari, opening up Chrome, whatever first-party app that you want to open, you'll see the icon jump on this MacBook for about 5-6 seconds. If you want to open it up on a newer MacBook, an ARM-based MacBook, it'll open up immediately. So that doesn't actually have much to do with processor speed. Yes, it does to a certain degree, but not the whole story. It's just the fact that Apple made the switch to ARM and everything is much more integrated than it was here. So that's just something to keep in mind. Okay, coming back to our main topic, which is this MacBook Air, and with a struggling CPU due to resource-intensive tasks comes high CPU temps. Now, modern Intel MacBooks all love running warm, and this MacBook Air is no exception. It has one fan that can spin up to 6500 RPM, but it won't do so unless you manually set it to. But I'll tell you this, because of its design, even when the computer is reaching around 85-90 degrees, it won't be warm to touch. So unless you're manually monitoring the CPU temps, you won't know that it's heating up. Also with a struggling CPU comes a questionable battery life. I mentioned earlier that I was able to get around 13 to 13.5 hours of battery life from this MacBook back when it was new, but today, even with a replacement battery that's brand new, I can't get more than 6 to 7 hours. I'm sure that the fact that I'm using a cheap replacement battery is playing a role in this, but it's not the main culprit. For what it's worth, it's been 8 years since this laptop came out, and apps and services in general got much more resource intensive. So that's the main reason why I can't get the original 12 hours. Overall, does it make sense to buy a pre-Retina MacBook Air in 2024? Let's do a quick calculation. I bought this laptop for $77 US, and I spent about $35 on a charger and a new battery. So about $110 US. Can you buy a better laptop for that price? I don't think so. You could possibly buy a desktop that could work, but then you lose out on the mobility part of things. And for what it's worth, if you're just looking for a machine to take notes in class, or to just watch YouTube videos, or to connect to a remote machine, like to do an SSH connection, this laptop will work. It'll work at least on the short run. You might want to get something a couple of years down the road, or even like a year down the road. But for now, it'll work. But if you want to go for a slightly longer term investment, I would certainly recommend that you go for something quad-core with 8 GB of RAM, and if your budget permits, a Retina screen. Back in the day, I didn't think that the Retina screen would make a big difference, but in 2024, now that I look at it, it's borderline unacceptable. But obviously the choice is yours. Thank you so much for watching. Please consider liking this video if you liked it, subscribing to my channel, leaving a comment down below, and I really hope I'll see you all the next time. Take care.